Deborah, Ralph, Phyllis, a teacher, a lawyer, a best-selling author. Andrea, a university professor. Bonnie, a generous donor to Orthodox synagogues. Rose, a playwright. These are people I know on social media. They are people I like, people I care about. I assume that they like me and care about me. I think of some of them as friends. Others are friends of friends. 2022, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. There are bodies lying in the street. There are torture chambers. There are threats of nuclear war. Americans are confused. There are isolationists and nativists telling Americans that Ukraine is far away, that there's no reason we should care about Ukraine. What do you know about Ukraine anyway? Ukraine is none of your business. In 2022, Tablet, a Jewish magazine, publishes an article calling Ukraine a freezing, muddy slaughterhouse, a place of year-round poverty. The article includes a graphic description of a pogrom that occurred over 100 years ago in Ukraine. Deborah, Ralph, and Phyllis amplify the article on social media. I say Ukraine is under attack. Innocent Ukrainians are dying. The Ukrainians who did bad things 100 years ago are probably all dead. We should extend our care to Ukraine. I am called an anti-Semite, and I lose friendship. My book, Bieganski, The Brute Polak Stereotype, Its Role in Polish-Jewish Relations and American Culture, describes a stereotype of Poles. My book, Bieganski, is about how we talk to each other. It is about how we talk to each other about the Holocaust, about Nazism, and about World War II. It's about how we talk to each other about anti-Semitism. My book is about how we talk about all hate and atrocity all over the world. It's about bigotry and prejudice and how we talk about bigotry and prejudice. It's about how we talk to each other about suffering, about whose suffering matters. Bieganski is a book about how we talk to each other. Here is a photograph of Pope John Paul II and Rabbi Elio Tawaf, the chief rabbi of Rome. This is an historic event. It is said to be the first time a pope has made an official visit to a synagogue. We see a Pole and a Jew, a Catholic and a Jew, a Christian and a Jew. By the way, the terms Pole and Jew are used by virtually all participants in Polish-Jewish dialogue. They are imperfect because, of course, someone can be both Polish and Jewish. Someone can be Jewish and not be religious at all. Someone can be Polish and yet not speak Polish or have ever visited Poland. These are imperfect terms, but we do use them. When a Pole and a Jew, a Christian and a Jew talk to each other, it may appear that there are only two people present, but in fact, they are on a minefield, a no man's land. There is a ghost, a specter, hovering over the conversation. That ghost is Shylock, and I use the term Shylock from a play by William Shakespeare. In the Shylock stereotype, Jews are crafty, conspiratorial, cliquish, greedy, whiny, mercantile, associated with money, physically unimpressive, and arrogant. What happens when Poles and Jews talk to each other? And in this photograph, you see two of my Facebook friends. Some of these people identify as Polish, even though they were born in the United States. Some of them identify as Jewish. What happens when we talk to each other? What happens? When Poles and Jews talk to each other, it's a minefield. It's a no man's land, because this stereotype of Shylock hovers over the conversation, and we do not want to feed into this stereotype. We want to talk, or we need to talk, about problematic aspects of Polish-Jewish relations. For example, the middleman minority status of Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Jewish members of the communist security apparatus, the Jews who collaborated with Soviet invaders, lack of Jewish assimilation as measured by the percent of Jews who spoke Polish as a first language. And those are the difficult topics on the Jewish side. There are difficult topics on the Polish side. For example, atrocities that Polish people have committed against Jews. And I will be addressing those difficult topics further on in this talk. But for now, I'm addressing these difficult topics. We must address these difficult topics because there are other people who want to monopolize the conversation. These people have a negative, destructive agenda. They want to dominate, to monopolize the conversation. And so they pick out these difficult topics and they say inflammatory and manipulative things. And if the good people who want peaceful relations don't talk about the difficult topics, the bad people who want violent relations will monopolize the topics, and good people should not allow that. One typical rhetorical tactic of these anti-Semites who want to monopolize the conversation is to page through the Talmud in search of controversial material. And they can take a controversial quote from the Talmud and say, aha, see, this is why Jewish person X did bad thing Y. It's because of this line from the Talmud. And it's easy to find controversial quotes in the Talmud because it is 2.5 million words long, and that is, of course, an estimate. It is a multi-volume work. It is almost 2,000 years old, and certainly there is material in the Talmud that is millennia old. And of course, you're going to find controversial lines in a document that large and that old. But doing this feeds into a stereotype. It is a destructive rhetorical tactic. When good people talk about these difficult topics, they walk on eggshells because they do not want to feed into the stereotype. I'll give you an example. In 1941, in West Ukraine, the NKVD committed heinous massacres of innocent people. Jews were disproportionately represented in the NKVD, especially in the 1930s, less so in the 1940s. So when we talk about this topic, we have to be very careful to say that some Jews did collaborate with the Soviet invaders, but not all Jews. Most communists were not Jews, and most Jews were not communists. There's a way of talking that supports stereotypes. There's a way of talking that resists stereotypes. To resist stereotypes, you say some, not all, members of Group X under a given set of historical circumstances, particular to a given place, a local geography, and a given time, that is history, engaged in behavior Y. And others who were not of this group also engaged in behavior Y. And an example of that is the founder of what became the NKVD was a man named Felix Dzerzhinsky. He was not Jewish. He was Polish. He was a Polish nobleman, and he was raised as a Catholic, and he committed atrocities. There's another paradigm that supports stereotyping. All or most members of Group X throughout history and geography, that is, wherever they are and whatever current history is, engage in behavior Y. No one else, not of this ethnicity, has done anything comparable. Behavior Y is essential, inextricable, essential to identity X. That is stereotyping thinking. Note, chauvinists do this too. People will say, my people have always been brave throughout history. That is self-stereotyping. If you'd like to see an example of some excellent scholarship that resists stereotyping, I recommend the introduction to this book about the NKVD prison massacres of 1941. The authors are dealing with inflammatory material about stigmatized groups, Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, Germans, Russians, and they absolutely refuse to engage in stereotyping. They talk about negative and positive behavior as something that any human under similar conditions might engage in. And this approach of resisting stereotyping is found in American mainstream media. The Atlantic is an influential publication in the United States, and at a time when Jewish people were disproportionately represented in financial scandals, for example, Bernie Madoff, who was a notorious Ponzi schemer, the Atlantic published this article telling its readers how to think about Jewish bankers. And the Atlantic tells its readers not to think stereotypically. My Jewish Learning, a website, educates its readers about stereotypes of Jews. And Tablet, the previously mentioned magazine that published the article about Ukraine as a land of pogroms, Tablet addresses how anti-Semites misuse the Talmud to promote anti-Semitism. So when people who mean well are conversing between Poles and Jews, those good, well-intentioned people do everything they can to resist the Shylock stereotype. Unfortunately, the Shylock stereotype is not the only stereotype. There is another stereotype, and that is the Bieganski brute Polak stereotype. And that stereotype haunts all conversations between Poles and Jews, and also between Christians and Jews, all Christians, whether they're Polish or not, between Christians and Jews, and also all people in any country talking about atrocity. And I will mention later in this talk how this stereotype is a universal stereotype. So when well-intentioned people talk about difficult things, the Bieganski stereotype haunts their conversation. In this stereotype, The stereotyped image, the Bieganski image, is more animal than human, brutal, violent, stupid, ignorant, dirty, primitive, unevolved, hateful, bigoted, chauvinistic, superstitious, read religious. That is, in this instance, Catholic, inferior to clean, educated, modern, multicultural, secular people. And you will note that for many of these qualities, the Bieganski stereotype is the mirror opposite, I should just say the opposite of the Shylock stereotype. The Shylock stereotype is associated with money. The Bieganski stereotype is associated with poverty. The Shylock stereotype is associated with urban settings. The Bieganski stereotype is associated with rural settings. The Shylock stereotype is associated with an unimpressive physique, someone who is either small or weak. The Bieganski stereotype is someone who is physically strong. The Shylock stereotype is associated with cleverness. The Bieganski stereotype is associated with stupidity, etc. The Bieganski stereotype is responsible for the Holocaust. In 2018, the Ruderman Family Foundation, which is a foundation dedicated to support for disabled people, released a video in which a series of Jewish people stare into the camera and repeat the words Polish Holocaust. The message of the Ruderman Foundation video is that Polish people are responsible for the Holocaust. At the end of the video is an appeal. One is to sign a petition asking the United States government to cut off all association with the government of Poland. And as you can see by this image, the Ruderman Foundation chose a soiled image of a Polish flag. Alan Dershowitz is an influential American celebrity. He taught law at Harvard. He has been the subject of fictional films. In other words, he's been depicted as a character in fictional films. He writes for influential publications. He is a powerful celebrity. He published in the Wall Street Journal an op-ed in which he created a metonym. Auschwitz equals Poland. Auschwitz equals church sermons. Auschwitz equals Catholicism. This is reminiscent of the tactic of anti-Semites who use quotes from the Talmud to say, well, see, this is why Jews do bad things. Dershowitz is citing Catholic church sermons and saying, see, this is why Poles do bad things, and even this is why Christians do things. This image is a 17th century French etching called The Revenge of the Peasants. Christopher R. Hill, an American ambassador, that is someone whose job it is to be diplomatic, and he has also held endowed chairs at a university teaching young people how to be diplomatic. He referred to Poland's Holocaust speech law as revenge of the peasants. Christopher R. Hill, a former ambassador to Poland, described Poland as a country of peasants. And what do these Polish peasants do? You can see in the image, they disembowel people, they impale people, they beat people, they lynch people. And here we can see Christopher R. Hill meeting with Joe Biden and Barack Obama, who have both been president of the United States and who have both been his boss. And Obama is famous for having said during one of his campaigns, he said this to his donors about people in Pennsylvania, that they are people who cling to guns and Bibles, and they're bigoted and they're prejudiced and they're scary. And Pennsylvania has a large Slavic population. Pennsylvania is a land of coal and steel production. Biden said to the New York Times in 2020, and I'm going to read Biden's quote, which is in Biden's unique speech style, and then I will try to translate it. And this is a direct quote from Joe Biden. Well, look what's happened. Look what started to seep in, beginning and probably even with candidates during our administration. We stopped showing up at the Polish American Club. We stopped showing up and we all went to you, the really smart people. We had a new kind of coalition we're putting together, college educated women and college men, and boom, 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 and so on. And what Biden is saying here is that when Democrats withdrew from their traditional base, which is working class people, which in the United States often has been associated with Polish people, they became successful because they turned away from the stupid, brutal Polish people and they turned to the smart, valuable, educated people. The Bieganski stereotype essentializes. What does it mean to essentialize? It means that a negative quality is inextricably associated with an ethnic or religious identity. Team Bieganski insists that being an anti-Semitic monster is something that all Poles are because of their essence, regardless of time, space, or local temporary conditions. Polish identity and Catholicism make Polish people feel bad things, think bad things, do bad things. And sometimes people say to me, but no one stereotypes Poles. This is not true. Please read the book. The stereotyping of Poles is amply documented. The stereotyping of Poles occurs in film. It occurs in the mainstream press. It occurs at the highest levels of scholarship and international conversations about Nazism and the Holocaust, and discussions of how these topics should be passed on to future generations in public education. It occurs in taxpayer-funded documentaries, and Bieganski appears in the personal experience narratives of people I interviewed for the book. This blog, Bieganski the blog, is over 10 years old. There are over 1,000 posts. I have never run out of material. I get more material than I can use. People are constantly sending me emails that I don't have time to follow up on. The New York Times posting a very positive obituary of a communist official, and this obituary expresses disdain for Polish Catholics. Sid Rosenberg, this is from September 2022. He's the #1 talk show host in the New York City market. He occupies the morning drive time, which is very popular because people are in their cars listening to the radio. Sid Rosenberg said to a colleague on air, "You're Polish? No wonder you are so stupid." Online conversations, Bieganski crops up constantly, and I document that in my blog. Judy Woodruff is a highly respected journalist. She is on PBS, which is funded with taxpayer dollars. In September 2022, she said that Poles went along silently with Nazism and that Poles are complicit in the Holocaust. And Poles are aware of Bieganski. Poles have tried to resist Bieganski, and Poles have engaged in certain predictable tactics to attempt to address Bieganski. And one tactic is to talk about how much Poles have suffered. And people who are invested in the Bieganski stereotype either don't care about Polish suffering or they don't believe that Poles have suffered. Konstantin Sword was a hugely successful 2001 book. It was written by James Carroll. James Carroll, his identity is important here. He is an Irish American. He's a former Catholic priest. Some people think that it's only Jews who stereotype Poles. That's absolutely not the case. This Irish-American Catholic priest is absolutely invested in the Bieganski stereotype. In this hugely successful book, he says that throughout the writing of the book, he locates himself at Polish suffering at Auschwitz, and then he lies about that suffering, and he says that there were only 150 Poles at Auschwitz, which is absolutely false. There were tens of thousands of Poles at Auschwitz, and for almost the first 2 years of its existence, the majority of the people there were Poles interned as Poles. And then later, of course, it became this horrific death camp that took the lives of many, many more Jews than Poles. James Carroll has no idea of this. This is Nazis rounding up peasants in Zamość, driving them out of their homes. And some of them, like Czesława Kłoka, ended up in Auschwitz, where that 14-year-old girl died. And the photograph in the background is Warsaw after the war. And in the upper left-hand corner, you see James Carroll looking rich, successful, and smug. Another tactic for addressing the Bieganski stereotype is to point to how many Poles rescued Jews during the Holocaust. The Polish rescue of Jews is significant for a couple of reasons. One reason is that the Nazi occupation of Poland was perhaps the worst Nazi occupation of any piece of territory in Europe. The Nazis entered Poland in 1939. They did not leave until 1945. Their policy was General Plan Ost, which was to wipe out the Polish population, and any remaining Poles would be turned into slaves. Poles were murdered by the Einsatzgruppen. Poles were denied enough food to carry on living. Museums, churches, etc. were destroyed. So under these horrific conditions, and also Poles were told that entire families would be killed if they rescued any Jews. Even if they gave a Jew a glass of water, they could be killed for that. Their parents could be killed for that. Their children could be killed for that. Neighbors could be killed if they knew about the aid and did not report the aid. So it's pretty remarkable that the largest national group honored by Yad Vashem are Poles, and the number as of right now is over 7,000. And so some people attempt to address the Bieganski stereotype by citing Polish aid to Jews. This tactic will not work because those invested in the Bieganski stereotype care more about the stereotype than they care about objective truth. Eva Hoffman, a Polish Jew, wrote a very, very excellent book called Shtetl. In her book Shtetl, she tells a story of a Holocaust survivor telling a story in which an instance after another, Poles helped the person to survive. And then at the end of the story, the person said, "Now you see why we hate the Polacks." So in the storyteller's mind, all those instances of help are erased, and the focus returns to any negative incidents. Yad Vashem, and this screen cap, I took it, I think, about 4 years ago. I don't know if the Yad Vashem page is still like this, but Yad Vashem diminishes Polish help in this page. The Economist refers to Poles who helped Jews as precious few. A university press published this book, They Were Just People, about Polish rescuers of Jews, and it depicts Polish rescuers as sadists, nameless, faceless sadists who take Jews in just to treat them badly. I posted a negative review of the book on Amazon, and one of the co-authors of the book, Rabbi Jacques Tsukierkorn, sent me an email calling me a pogromist because of my negative review on Amazon, which you are free to read. Władysław Bartoszewski is one of the most heroic people I know anything about. He was an Auschwitz prisoner. He co-founded or helped to found Żegota. He was inspired to do this by advice he received from a Catholic priest. He fought in the Warsaw Uprising. After the war, he made it a point to condemn events like the Kielce pogrom. He joined a group called the Anti-Racist League. He was then arrested by the Soviets. He was friends with Lech Wałęsa. He's an honorary citizen of Israel. He traveled to Israel and he was insulted in the Knesset. And he was also insulted by Germans. His actual character does not matter. All that matters is that he's Polish, so he's bad, and he must be insulted. And yes, that is the logic of stereotyping. It's this essentializing. You come from a certain ethnic group, you're no good. Jan Karski is an amazing hero. He was a Polish officer. He might have been part of the officers massacred at the Katyn Forest by the Soviets, where they massacred tens of thousands of Polish army officers, military officers. He escaped from that situation. He worked with the underground. He was captured. He was tortured. He was tortured so badly he attempted suicide by slitting his wrists. He escaped from that situation. He willingly was smuggled into what he thought was a concentration camp, and I think it was actually a transport camp. He was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto. He saw the horrors that the Nazis were committing. He volunteered to travel to the UK and to the United States, and he had to travel under these dangerous conditions because if the Germans caught him, once again he would have been tortured. He had already experienced Nazi torture. And he volunteered to travel under these unsafe conditions to the UK to meet with Churchill and also to the US. And so this man is tremendously heroic. And there's a play called Remember This about Jan Karski. And I argue in this review, which I invite you to read, that this play plays into the Bieganski stereotype. So even Poles who do good things are still used to support the Bieganski stereotype. This is happening even as I make this recording. The Jewish Museum of Florida, God bless them, may they have a long, successful life. They're hosting a program called Passports for Life about the Wadosh group, which rescued Jews during the Holocaust. This is an undercovered story. It deserves much more coverage. Again, this is Wadosh, which would be spelled in English Lados. And these were Polish diplomats, some of them Jewish, some of them not Jewish, who prepared faked passports for Jews so that they would not be murdered. And some people say they rescued hundreds of lives. Other people say they rescued thousands of lives. Research is ongoing. And the Jewish Museum of Florida is hosting a program dedicated to this. And I think this is a wonderful thing. And Saul Chapnick, who blogs at the Times of Israel, sent an open letter to the Jewish Museum of Florida demanding that the program be canceled. He wants it to be canceled. Why does he want it to be canceled? Because if you talk about Poles who rescued Jews during the Holocaust, you are engaging in Holocaust revisionism, according to Saul Chapnick. To Team Bieganski, any good Pole is just one little differently colored bead in an abacus, and the rest of the abacus is all the other color, because the negative qualities of Bieganski are essential. They are inbred and they can't be changed. Any good Pole is a black swan. It's the exception that proves the rule. And another way to address the Bieganski stereotype is to say, but look at Poles and Poland's intense appreciation of Jewish culture. And this is something that scholar Harold B. Siegel mentions in his book, Stranger in Our Midst. He says that Polish literature, like high art literature, is the greatest Jewish literature in Europe, And that, yes, there is anti-Semitic material in that body of literature, but there is also material that celebrates Jewishness and Jewish identity in Poland and in Polish literature that cannot be matched by any other country or culture. I first visited Poland back in the 1970s, and at that time I met people who were attempting to help to preserve Jewish presence in Poland. This is a book by a German man, and it's about Polish woodcarvers. And these are people who live in small villages and who are not making tons of money for their work. So in other words, these are people creating art from their heart. They're not doing it for fame. They were doing this under the Soviet government when Poland was pretty much cut off from the West. One man, one woodcarver, Wacław Czerwiński, his mother died at Ravensbrück, which was a Nazi concentration camp, which had many Polish inmates. He said he carves Jews as an indictment to the Germans so that the persecuted should not remain mute, which is a pretty amazing statement when you consider that the Bieganski stereotype says that all Polish peasants are hateful anti-Semites. Adam Zagadło said, of Jews, there were good people who looked after me and trained me. I made these wood carvings in honor of their memory. I believe that when you feel sympathy for someone who has played an important role in your life, then you should attempt to portray some of it. I can still visualize them today. I went to the synagogue too to find out about their creed. It is my aim not to let the traces of this ancient culture sink into oblivion. So did Poles appreciate Jewish culture? Many of them, yes, did. And here's Adam Zagadło. And there's also the Poland Museum. There's the Jewish festival in Kraków, which is said to be the largest and oldest festival of Jewish culture in the world. How is this received when Polish people express appreciation for Jewish culture? What do other people say about it? Some people call it necrophilia. Some people call it cultural appropriation. Some people call Poles vultures. It's called imperialism. It's called economic exploitation. These are all expressions of the Bieganski stereotype. Another tactic, another attempt to address the Bieganski stereotype is to say, look how heroic we have been. And the truth is that Polish history, including the history of Poland during World War II, offers us examples of heroism that are completely, you will not find more impressive examples of heroism anywhere in the world. So what is the reaction when Poles attempt to address the Bieganski stereotype by talking about heroic Poles? We're called chauvinist, we're called nationalist, we're called Nazis. If we talk about the Poles that we're proud of, it's seen as a bad thing because we are all Bieganski. There's another tactic that is used to address the Bieganski stereotype, and that is the tactic of denial. Denial is the person who says there's no such thing as Polish anti-Semitism. Poles never committed any atrocities. These people are deluded and they are telling lies. And good people have nothing to do with the anti-Semites. I want to be proud of Jan Karski. I want to be proud of Tadeusz Kościuszko. I want to be proud of Irene Sendler. I am also ashamed of the Kielce pogrom. I am ashamed of Polish anti-Semitism. And I do everything I can to reject it and to stop it. So denial is not going to work. Yes, Poles have done bad things. The point of Bieganski is not that no Poles have ever done any bad things. The point is that the bad things Poles have done are talked about differently than the bad things done by members of other ethnic and religious groups. It really is all about how we talk to each other. And if you want to see an example of what I think is responsible speech about atrocities committed by Poles, I ask you to read my review of a book called The August Trials by Andrew Kornbluth. And you can find the review on my blog. I posted it on June 23rd, 2021. And I do everything I can in that review to model responsible speech about Poles who committed atrocities against Jews. There's another tactic for addressing the Bieganski stereotype, and that is more or less to surrender, to say, yes, these rural peasants are bad people, but I'm a good person because I'm not a rural peasant. Bieganski was old, I'm young. Bieganski was rural, I'm urban. Bieganski was dirty, I bathe daily. Bieganski was Catholic, I'm an atheist, Buddhist, Taoist, pagan, Wiccan. Bieganski was of the past, I'm modern. Bieganski was uneducated, I have an advanced degree. Bieganski was a chauvinist, I'm multicultural. This approach is intellectually empty and it is morally wrong. The past, talk to me about the past. King Kazimierz Wielki, that is King Casimir the Great, lived in the 14th century. He was a friend to the Jews. Eliza Orzeszkowa lived in the 19th century. She was a friend to the Jews. The Statute of Kalisz dates from the 13th century. It guaranteed Jewish rights in great detail. The Warsaw Confederation dates from the 16th century. It codified the religious freedom that had been part of Polish culture for some time. So all of these people and events are from the past. And this past is better than some of the events that have happened more recently in time. The idea that the present is always better than the past is a fallacy. Some people say that if you're a Polish patriot or a Polish nationalist, that makes you a Bieganski. Sofia Baniecka was a self-identified Polish patriot. She rescued Jews during the Holocaust, and she said she did so because she was a Polish patriot. Some people say that being Catholic makes you Bieganski. Sister Teresa Janina Kierocińska is very important to me because she saved the life of the mother-in-law of my friend Liron. And here is Liron's mother-in-law with nuns from the order who saved her life when she was a child during the Holocaust in Poland. The Ulma family were devoutly Catholic. We have their family Bible. We see that underlined passages in the Bible, in the Ulma family Bible, talk about love and extending love to one's neighbor. 6 children, the father, the mother who was 9 months pregnant, were all killed by the Nazis because of their help to Jews. These were Catholic, rural peasants. Maria Maciasz was a rescuer of Jews. I could not find a photograph of her on the web, so I just found a photograph of a babcia. She was illiterate. So being uneducated, according to the stereotype, makes you Bieganski. But there were unlettered, unschooled Polish Catholic peasants who saved. And after all of this headache-inducing material, you may be throwing up your hands and saying, why should I care? What's it to me? I'm not Polish. I'm not Jewish. I don't want to think about all this stuff. Why should I care? One reason you might want to care is because the world is getting smaller and more multicultural, and people are living cheek by jowl. Poles and Jews, according to Eva Hoffmann in her excellent book Shtetl, are an example of multiculturalism avant la lettre. Before multiculturalism was invented as a word or a concept, Poles and Jews were living multicultural lives. If Poles and Jews can get along, who can't get along? If Poles and Jews can't get along, who can get along? You might want to care because, as I've said in this presentation, the Bieganski stereotype is universal. It is invoked in atrocities around the world. In the United States, we have this idea of poor rural people whom we call white trash, trailer trash, redneck, hillbillies, Okies, and we blame our problems on them. And in India, where there is problems between Hindus and Muslims, I read articles in the New Yorker that talk about rural Indians, religious Indians, being the cause of all the problems. So the Bieganski stereotype is found around the world. You might care because of this. You see a healthy young man, a member of the Einsatz grouping, at point blank range, shooting to death a mother and child. And this photograph, by the way, was rescued from oblivion by the Polish underground. It went through a post office and the postal worker saved it in order to document Nazi crimes. We want to understand this. How could people like us commit crimes like this? And in trying to understand Nazism, the Bieganski stereotype obscures, it does not clarify. The Bieganski stereotype is convenient. As long as the Holocaust is the product of these rural religious people, then it's not our problem because we're not rural, we're not religious. We are innocent because we're modern, we're multicultural, we're atheists, what have you. But this explanation, as I said, is intellectually void and it is immoral because many of the top Nazis were well-educated people with advanced degrees. And this Bieganski explanation is also a problem because it does not help us to understand this. Nazis massacring Polish civilians in Bochnia. When the Nazis first entered Poland, they started shooting Poles, not identified as Jews, people identified as Poles. They started decapitating society and communicating brutality through these mass slaughters of Poles. Nazis shooting Poles in Leszno. Nazis standing over Polish peasants they have murdered. A smiling Nazi despoiling a poor Polish peasant family. Once again, think back to that whole idea that Polish peasants are Nazis and are responsible for the Holocaust, and look at this picture and try and reconcile these two concepts. You cannot, because one of the concepts is false. How do you explain pictures like this if you believe in the Bieganski stereotype? Nazis shooting to death Polish Catholic priests en masse, shooting to death one singular Polish Catholic priest, Antoni Zawistowski tortured and died in Auschwitz, Dachau, or excuse me, not Auschwitz, Dachau. Dachau was called the largest monastery in Germany, and I think most of the clergy there were Polish. In their very kind review of my book, the journal American Jewish History said that Bieganski exists to take blame for the Holocaust away from Nazism and place it on someone else. And this is something that occurred in Hollywood movies, and it's something that I document on my blog. There have been a series of Hollywood films whose job it was exculpate or to remove blame from Nazis, Nazi Germany, and there's many of these blog posts. A very excellent book, The Seventh Million, The Israelis and the Holocaust by Tom Segev, I recommend that everyone read it, includes this line: someone, after all, has to be guilty of the Holocaust. We have to hate someone, and we've already made up with the Germans. And as Segev says, this statement was made by an Israeli Holocaust tourist in Poland who decided to hate the Poles because they've already made peace with the Germans, so now it's time to blame the Poles. Another really difficult, complicated issue, and yes, we have to talk about the difficult stuff too. The Nazis are responsible for the Holocaust, but Jews in Israel and the United States looked on in horror and felt helpless. And this book, The Seventh Million, talks about Israelis' mixed feelings about the Holocaust, and blaming Poland is a psychic defense for how Israelis feel or felt about Holocaust victims. And here's an article from Commentary, 1983, Indicting American Jews. This article, there's so many things that I want people to read, and this is one of those things that I want people to read because it's as if the conversation that Jews have with Poles, why didn't you rescue us? Why didn't you do more? Was just simply transferred to American Jews. The exact same things are said, the exact same things. You were sitting in New York or Cincinnati or Los Angeles eating a big dinner, and my grandfather was starving in the ghetto, and you didn't do anything to help. And this article inspired page after page after page of letters in response to the article. And let me make clear, the Nazis are responsible for the Holocaust, certainly not American Jews. American Jews, I think, were powerless to stop the Holocaust. But still, one can have a psychic feeling of, I should have done something and I didn't. And the Bieganski stereotype helps to heal that wound because you can blame someone else. You can project all of your negative feelings onto another population. There are some people, and Alan Dershowitz, I would argue, in his Wall Street Journal piece, is one of those people who attempt to draw a straight line between interwar Polish anti-Semitism and Nazism. And yes, Poland in the interwar period, that is after the end of World War I and before the beginning of World War II, anti-Semitism was a powerful force in Polish culture, politics, etc. It wasn't the only force. There were more embracing views of what it meant to be a Pole, and that embracing view would be personalized by Józef Pilsudski, who's a huge hero to Poles and who had a very embracing view. You can be Jewish and Polish, you can be Lithuanian and Polish, etc. But there were other Poles who were dedicated anti-Semites. Jan Mosdorf, a self-identified anti-Semite, after the Nazis invaded, helped Jews. And I mention Mosdorf because there is no straight line, I would argue, no straight line between the anti-Semitism that absolutely existed in Poland in the interwar period and Nazism. And by the way, Jan Mosdorf was murdered in Auschwitz. Here's Cardinal Holland. Cardinal Holland wrote a letter in the interwar period that was critical of some aspects of Jewish culture at the time in Poland, and it's widely criticized. People are shocked by this letter. And if Cardinal Holland represented interwar anti-Semitism, one might think that he would have joined with the Nazis. In fact, the Gestapo offered him freedom and power, and he declined, and he was part of the resistance, and his resistance helped Jews. This is Maximilian Kolbe, who is rightfully a saint. He gave his life for another in Auschwitz. Maximilian Kolbe edited a journal that when he was not, I think he was in Japan at the time, published a small number of articles that were critical of Jews. He did not write them, others wrote them. He was initially arrested when the Nazis first invaded Poland. They mistreated him. They called him a Polish pig. It was a terrifying experience. Then they released him. He went back to his monastery and he helped thousands of Jews. He was arrested again. He was sent to Auschwitz. So someone like Christopher Hitchens calls Kolbe an anti-Semite. I would argue against that. People who were assigned to investigate him argued against that. Sigmund Gorsen was a Jewish man who survived Auschwitz. He testified to Maximilian Kolbe being pure love. He knew I was a Jewish boy. That made no difference. His heart was bigger than persons, whether they were Jewish, Catholics, or whatever. He loved everyone. This is Sofia Kossak-Szczucka in an underground pamphlet, which may or may not have been sincere. She may have been assuming a persona for the purposes of the pamphlet. She identified as an anti-Semite. She co-founded Żegota, where she worked to get help for Jews, and she was sent to Auschwitz. So this is all really complicated. It's not as simple as Alan Dershowitz wants things to be. There was a Jewish man named Salil Perechodnik, who knew a couple of Polish Catholic guys before the war. They were named Stefan and Staszek, and they were anti-Semitic, and they had no Jewish friends. During the war, they helped Jews. And again, this is in a country where the Nazis could kill you for helping Jews. These two Polish guys who before the war identified as anti-Semites, didn't know any Jews, during the war helped Jews. And this is reported by a Jewish man living under Nazi occupation. And he says that he knew another woman who was very noble and always said the right things and was known as a liberal. The Nazis move in, she turned against Jews. So this is just really complicated, and it's also extremely complicated in the case of Perechodnik. He had a really rough time of it. He actually became part of the Jewish police and escorted his own wife and child into the transport to Treblinka, and then later he joined the Home Army and was killed in combat fighting for Poland. So there's another problem with Alan Dershowitz's argument that there's a straight line, unbroken line between Polish pre-war anti-Semitism and Nazism. There was a country that I would argue is every bit as anti-Semitic as Poland, a country where Jews were often denied access to a college education because they were Jewish. Jewish doctors were denied jobs because they were Jewish. Jewish lawyers were denied jobs because they were Jewish. This country lynched people, lynched Italians, lynched Jews. Leo Frank, all of his lynchers were known. They never faced consequences. This country published obscenely, disgustingly racist material about immigrants from Eastern Europe, material that was written by Kenneth Roberts, a best-selling novelist, and it was published in the Saturday Evening Post, which was an utterly mainstream publication. This country shot Polish, Slovak, Hungarian strikers dead in Latimer, Pennsylvania, and in other places. And this country did not produce a Holocaust. And this country was the United States. No Nazism, no Holocaust. So, yeah, I disagree with Alan Dershowitz. So, I'm fighting against this stereotype, but what about real life? What about the horrible things that people do? And this is a photograph of victims of the Kielce pogrom being buried. And the Kielce pogrom was just one of many pogroms committed by Poles against Jews after the Holocaust, which makes it all the more horrifying. How do we understand things like this? How do we understand these people? These people were Jewish communists who tortured and murdered and defamed Poles who fought against Nazis, and then buried them in unmarked graves. How can we understand Jews who tortured the people who were trying to help them and trying to defeat Nazism? How do we understand understand. And here we have two of the people who were tortured and murdered, Witold Pilecki and Emil August Fieldorf. These people were huge heroes who did incredibly wonderful things. Tortured, murdered, defamed, buried in unmarked graves by Jews. My friends, my former friends, Deborah, Ralph, and Phyllis, say that we shouldn't help Ukraine because of bad things that Ukrainians have done against Jews. How do we explain this man, Lazar Kaganovich, who was Jewish and who was a top communist and who played a key role in the Holodomor, which starved millions of Ukrainians to death? Should we always have enmity between Poles and Jews, between Ukrainians and Jews, between Ukrainians and Poles, because Ukrainians committed massacres of Poles and Poles oppressed the Ukrainians? Should we always cling to these hatreds? How do we understand this? This is my country. This is a postcard. It's a postcard. This went through the mail. This was mailed in the 1930s. It's a lynching. It's a horrible crime against Black people who were tortured and murdered. They were sometimes burned alive. They were sometimes castrated. Sometimes their body parts were sold. How do we understand this? If we understand atrocity as something that Polish people do, we are not understanding. If we understand atrocity that's something that Jewish people do, we are not understanding. If we understand atrocity as something that Germans do, we are not understanding. If we understand atrocity as something that people do under certain historical conditions, people just like us, we are beginning to understand. This is Corporal Gustav Gross. He fought in North Africa and on the Eastern Front. He won 2 Iron Crosses. Given where my family lived in Poland, for all I know, he could have participated in their death. This is Judah Burr. He was murdered by the Nazis under very bad conditions I will not detail here. On the right, you see the Ken cart of Makla Burr, his daughter, who was murdered by the Nazis. This is Bronisława Zarkower. She got out of Poland in time. Her uncle went back to Poland for her grandmother, and neither made it out alive. These are my parents, Polish peasant, Slovak peasant. My father told me that my grandmother's family was wiped out by the Nazis. I have no way of knowing if that's true. My grandmother was illiterate. Her family was illiterate. Information was only exchanged through third parties, and I know virtually nothing about them. This is Otto Gross. He is the son of Gustav Gross, the Nazi corporal. This is Liron. She is the granddaughter of Judah. This is Karen. She is the daughter of Bronisława, and this is me. And we are friends. We are real friends. Thank you.